Well, good morning or afternoon or evening to all of you who are watching this little video. I'm Barbara Gray from Penn State University. I'm an Emerita professor there. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with one of my old graduate school buddies from Case Western Reserve, Dr. Rajesh Tandon. The reason that we're speaking to you today is that we want to stimulate some interest in the upcoming conference sponsored by CSSI on power and inclusion in partnerships. So I want to tell you just a little bit about Rajesh and why he and I are doing this. I've been working academically on power and working with those concepts for many years in the books that I've written on collaboration. And Rajesh has been out there in the field in India, making it all work. So he has created an organization, founded an organization called Participatory Research in Asia, or PRIA. And he has worked at that for 45 years since he left Case from graduate school, after graduate school. So I thought I would ask Rajesh to start out a question or two, and then he's going to ask me some questions if we have time. But I would like to say, Rajesh, how do you define power in the work that you do?
Well, it's the capacity to influence. Thanks, Barbara. I think you are posing questions which are more based on the experience you also have. But let me say that how I became aware of it. I was doing this work with the rural indigenous communities in India as part of my PhD fieldwork. And when I went there, I already had an engineering degree and MBA and was teaching in a school of management when I came for my PhD program. And I would go to the village communities and be introduced by somebody who took me there. And people will sort of get up. They will give me a chair or a stool to sit on, and they will sit on the floor. And I found it a little awkward. And gradually it occurred to me that their reverence was not just because I was very talented and very capable. Their reverence was imbibed in them because I seemed to be coming from cities. I seemed to be very formally educated. I may have had economic and political connections in the outside world to which they were not privy. And so I became acutely aware of the kind of influence I was having, even by my presence, sheer presence, let alone saying anything. And I was not going to say much. I was going to ask them. And my purpose was to interview them, to collect some data for my fieldwork. And so this capacity to influence one's own future and to improve one's conditions. Everybody wants to improve their condition, irrespective of their economic or social status. But there are obstacles to their capacity, and I think that's where power, both in terms of interpersonal, but also diversified sources of power in terms of traditionally we think it's income, wealth, economic status, or capacity to wield reward and punishment, etc., etc. But sheer fact that you are more seen to be more knowledgeable, more educated, and you come from metro-centric world seems to imply you must be knowing very powerful people. So your network of connections can be seen as a source of great power.
I can remember being in China with one of my PhD students, and I wanted to go to the Buddhist temple there. And there was a long line of worshipers at one door. And Amin said to me, "Come on, Barbara, we're going to this other door," where we just immediately walked right in. And I never felt such privilege, and it was so uncomfortable as that moment, when I somehow was able to step ahead of all those people for no reason. I mean, there was absolutely no reason except that my visit to China was short. That didn't really entitle me to that privilege. So, Rajesh, we have both studied many different partnerships. And I know that you've worked very closely with Bud Hall from University of Victoria, and written a wonderful paper called Decolonization of Knowledge. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how knowledge feeds into power in partnerships, and especially what you mean by epistemicide.
When we began the work, Bud Hall and I got to know each other when I was writing my PhD thesis at Case. He was at Toronto at that time. And I was in my fieldwork confronted with a situation where, despite my excellent formal knowledge, I seemed to be incapable of navigating the rural terrain. And despite their seemingly semi-literate status, the rural community members seem to have exceptional understanding of their context and water resources, cattle management, soil conditions, how weather affects productivity of land, all these. And I was sort of intrigued by this question that how come they know more than I do? And and and, and I put in so many years of formal education. And so we began to use the physiology of participatory research without fully understanding at that time its full implication. The starting point was that if I have to work in partnership with this community, I cannot change them, only they can change themselves. I can help them understand how they change. Because in the very early years, I began to understand how learning and organizing go together towards empowerment. So you have to learn about your reality and others' reality, but also you have to collectivize a little bit. So I became, I said, well, I have to work with them, so I have to participate with them. But I didn't understand its full implication at that time. More or less, I assumed if I participate with them and they participate with me, it's the same thing. But it was not. It was not, because the research questions, the kind of curiosity I brought to their context was not their research question, was not their starting point. I was interested in literacy and women's education. And they were interested in survival because of drought or whatever. And so the over the years, we began to realize that the formal system of education and knowledge production that all of us have been well trained in is only 400 years old. And it has become universal such that we in the academia and even the communities who are outside seem to think this is the only knowledge system. But surely human civilization survived before. There are communities, indigenous communities, fisherfolk communities, Arctic communities, which are surviving and doing very well, ecologically at least, without formal education. And so there exist other knowledge systems, but those other knowledge systems are very closely linked to their lived experience, their realities of culture, language, rituals, and bulk of the what we consider as the gold standard of knowledge, which we are all trained in, is carried out in 3 or 4 European languages. So it's a, so when I began to interact and work with local communities, it became obvious that their knowledge system I didn't understand because it was demonstrated not through the ways of the world I was schooled in. They were not writing books or articles at that time. They were there was the oral tradition, there's a lot of knowledge in rituals that were carried forward. And,
But
and
you
so,
would agree that we've been dismissive of those forms of knowledge, right?
exactly. And
And
so
this is what
epistemicide,
you mean by epistemicide, right?
absolutely,
Is our
absolutely.
callous dismissal of those things.
Dismissive. And, the conquest, I realized that if you can convince those who are excluded that the reason they are excluded is because something wrong with them, it's like gender violence, women get convinced many a time that something wrong they're doing, that's why they get beaten up.
Yes,
But
it's their fault.
it's their fault. And so if they imbibe in themselves that they are poor, excluded, marginalized, or voiceless because something is wrong with them, then the status quo can continue. And no change is required. So this is even more effective than guns and sticks kind of thing. You convince people. So epistemicide is being dismissive of communities' knowledge culture, knowledge system, and imposing in a way, the dominant knowledge system that we are all schooled in. And that's why we tend to consider our knowledge as universal, objective. It works in all situations. It doesn't work in all situations. Doesn't work even in a country inside, because of the diversities.
So in partnerships, the people that are coming with their particular knowledge systems aren't necessarily aware of this, that there may be other knowledge systems than their own. And by virtue of their privilege, they'll probably impose those knowledge systems on the partnership, which then leaves some people feeling excluded right from the start. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and that's where the the empowerment process is essential if you want a partnership to be sustainable and effective. Otherwise, getting a seat on the table is not enough. You must be able to influence the conversation around the table and shape it
Yes.
to fulfill your own needs. Otherwise, you will drop out of the partnership.
Yes, in a study that I didn't conduct, but which I benefited greatly from the published research that was dealing with a partnership in Peru over gold mining and externalities from gold mines. That partnership had to fold after 4 years of work because the senior partners, so to speak, and I say that in quotes and air quotes, the senior partners, the people with power, never really wanted to cede any of that power and control to the indigenous people who were seated at the table. And while there were facilitators and all of the mechanisms that we know about that are supposed to work with partnerships, ultimately the International Monetary Fund had to throw up their hands and say, this partnership, doesn't work. But what did work, and I'd like to get your take on this also, is when that kind of collaboration and sharing of knowledge doesn't happen, we have to resort to other means if people want to have power over decisions that affect their lives. So in that case, there was a second mine which these people protested, and they were successful by protest when they couldn't be successful through a collaborative table. And that mine has not opened because of their protest. So can you give an example from your work where you felt a protest was the more effective tool than collaboration?
Well, this is going on around the world, but more in terms of indigenous communities in India are increasingly getting organized to protest displacement from their traditional land and forest resources. And historically, they have been pushed to areas which were least developed economically. So they are living over last 300-400 years of the British colonization process. They are living on top of lands which are still not mined, so to speak. So their land and their mineral resources and their timber, forest cover, etc., is very precious to the greedy eyes. And they are basically saying that these are our traditional lands. They have spiritual notions around land and trees and you know mountains, and so they are getting organized because the law gives them the right to influence. There is a law which is supposed to protect their land. So they as a collective community can decide whether they want to give mineral rights and under what terms and conditions. But as we know, the relationship is so uneven in terms of power. You know, big companies, multinational companies, in cahoots with government officials and politicians, they have no power. So the only places where they have been able to negotiate better terms is where they have been able to organize protests, and even the big houses like Tata's, you know, had to basically stop what they were doing and come to table. So the tribal community, indigenous communities forced them to come to table. They were not interested in coming to table. So where negotiations succeed, where terms of because now young people among their communities are also educated and they know the outside world, how it operates and behaves, and they have allies, and a lot of professionals ally with their perspective because they value ecological sustainability as opposed to quick profits.
Right. I have a feeling that you and I could go on for an hour and never be mindful of the clock. But I think it's probably time for us to hope that we have stimulated interest in this topic among those people who might be coming to the conference, and that they will also take the opportunity to look more closely at the work that you've done, since we couldn't persuade you to come all the way to South Africa for the conference. But thank you so much for.
Thank you, Barbara. Lovely catching up today, and all the very best for the conference.
Thank you so much, Rajesh. Bye now.
Bye bye. Now close the recording.